Hi, and welcome to today's Daily Chronicle. Today is Tuesday, October 14th, 2025. After Spain's blackout, critics blamed renewable energy. It's part of a bigger attack. Last spring, tens of millions of people lost electricity across Spain, Portugal, and part of France. Trains stopped in their tracks, and people were stuck in elevators as southwestern Europe went without power for, in some cases, more than 10 hours. Immediately, the finger pointing began. Many people blamed solar and wind energy. Spain, one of Europe's front runners in renewable energy, gets about 46% of its power from solar and wind, according to the think tank Ember, sometimes more than 70%. In the hours after the outage, the Daily Mail published the headline, "Could renewable energy be to blame for a huge Spain blackout?" And on the day of the outage, U.S. Energy Secretary and former fracking executive Chris Wright went on CNBC to talk about the outage and criticized solar and wind. "When you hitch your wagon to the weather," Wright said, "it's just a risky endeavor." The idea that solar and wind are inherently risky and unreliable is a common talking point for critics of renewable energy. Often repeat by groups with ties to the fossil fuel industry, it's false. When renewable energy is paired with large batteries or other forms of grid management, it's proven to be reliable. Now, a new report from an expert panel of European grid operators details what happened. The report finds that for the first time in Europe, a voltage surge caused the massive outage. Voltage needs to remain within limits for an electrical grid to work. While many things went wrong, the problem was not a power grid with too much wind or solar, says Chris Roslow, a senior energy analyst at Ember who was not involved in drafting the report. It contradicts the numerous claims that we've seen. Then over-reliance on renewables was the cause, Roslow says. That is clearly not true. But the misinformation about the solar and wind energy causing the outage has had an impact. A new survey found that a majority of Spanish respondents believe at least one false narrative about the blackout, and that the most common was that too much reliance on renewable energy was to blame. Countries around the world are using renewable energy to move away from polluting fossil fuels. That's why it's so important to counter false narratives about solar and wind, says Philip Newell, communications co-chair of the Climate Action Against Disinformation, a coalition of nonprofits. This content makes it more normal and feel more normal to hate on renewables, Newell says, even though they're a solution to climate change. What did happen before the outage? The new report from the European grid operators expert panel found multiple triggers shortly before the blackout. First, oscillations, or sudden swings, in power flow hit the grid. It's still unclear what caused them. Spain's main grid operator took steps to control the oscillations, including sending less power to France. While these actions helped dampen the oscillations, they caused the voltage to surge upwards. Voltage is like pressure in a water system. Just like it's key to have certain amount of pressure for water to flow, there needs to be a certain amount of voltage to push electrons through a circuit. but voltage can't be too high, or it can cause short circuits or even fire. When the voltage surged, transformers and power plants shut down. Antonio Gomez Exposito, electrical engineering professor at University of Seville, says the outage shows that Spain needs more regulations around controlling voltage. The expert panel report, like other recent analysis from Spain's government and main grid operator, does not indicate that reliance on solar or wind power led to the outage. The panel will issue a final report next year. Newell says the immediate accusations against renewable energy didn't surprise many people who study attacks on climate solutions. We've known this has been a recurring issue, Newell says. The big frame is that renewables are bad and we can't trust them. Renewable critics said blackout was caused by lack of inertia. It wasn't. When critics of renewable energy pointed the finger at solar or wind for causing the blackout, many used one word: inertia. Michael Schellenberger, a longtime critic of renewable energy and proponent of nuclear power, with 1.4 million followers on X, said in a post the day of the blackout, "Renewables don't risk blackouts," said the media, but they did and they do. It's clear that too little inertia due to excess solar resulted in system collapse. Inertia is important to the electrical grid because it can help stabilize the sudden fluctuations in the grid's frequency. Power plants that run on gas, coal, and nuclear use large spinning turbines that create electricity and have inertia. More modern power resources like wind, solar, and batteries don't involve inertia because they are digitally controlled. Wind and solar plants either have no inertia or very little, Gomez Exposito says, but in return they have infinitely greater response needs. Speeds. There is no indication that a lack of inertia was the cause of the outage, Gomez Exposito says, Spain's main grid operator. Red Electra released a report about the outage this summer. The incident was not caused by an inertia problem. It was in a press release. Renewable misinformation has an impact. False claims that too much reliance on solar and wind caused the blackout in Spain and Portugal fit into broader attacks on renewable energy. In winter 2021, a massive power outage hit Texas. Investigations ultimately found that the outage's cause was gas and coal plants that were forced offline because of freezing temperatures. But critics of renewable energy blamed solar and wind, says Timmons Roberts, professor of environmental studies and sociology at Brown University. In 2021, again, there was uncertainty on what caused it, but immediately there were attacks on renewable energy, Roberts says, sort of exploiting, taking advantage of a crisis to make unfounded accusations. Shortly after the power went out in Spain, Newell and his team of the Climate Action Against Disinformation Coalition decided to do a survey about false narratives in the blackout's wake. They surveyed 1,200 people in Spain and 1,200 in the United Kingdom, because many in the UK were also paying attention to the outage. They found 7 in 10 in Spain and 6 in 10 in the UK fell for at least one false narrative about the blackout causes. The most commonly believed false narrative was that the reliance on renewables was at fault. Newell says while most of the survey respondents acknowledged the reality of climate change, misinformation led to many questions the reliability of renewable energy. Renewable energy plus batteries proving to be reliable in a warming world. Solar and wind resources are already proving to be part of a reliable grid, says Elliot Mainzer, chief executive of the California Independent System Operator, which assures the reliability of California's grid. California was powered by 2/3 clean energy in 2023, the latest year for which data is available. Mainzer says the key is pairing solar and wind energy with massive batteries. Batteries are especially important with solar, as they absorb excess solar energy during the day and send it back into the grid after the sun sets. Evening demand stays high, Mainzer says. Mainzer says older power sources have their own problems. California faces a loss of hydropower during droughts, and Mainzer says gas power plants have some reliability challenges too. During the kind of heat waves we've seen in recent years, the natural gas plants can come under the significant strain, Mainzer says. They have to run harder. They mechanically get challenged. And we tend to see a higher outage rate amongst the gas fleet when the temperatures are really, really hot. Mainzer says the use of solar plus batteries helped prevent blackouts in California in 2022, when there was a heat wave hitting much of the state and gas plants were underperforming. Texas main grid operator ERCOT has said that the increase in solar and battery storage has helped the state avoid power outages, especially as the state sees unexpected outages with coal plants. As the planet sees longer and more intense heat waves with global warming, primarily caused by humans burning fossil fuels, Mainzer says solar combined with batteries, both of which perform well in the heat, will be important to keep the lights on. Smithsonian Museums and National Zoo set to close as shutdown takes its toll. Panda Bao Li eat bamboo at the Smithsonian National Zoo in Washington, D.C. on January 28th. The zoo, as well as other Smithsonian facilities, will be closed beginning on October 12th as the government shutdown continues. As the government shutdown drags on, Smithsonian museums the National Zoo and other facilities are the latest to be caught in the fray. With the Federal Trust announcing the closure of all its sites beginning on Sunday. We will update our operating status as soon as the situation is resolved. The Smithsonian announced on social media, "We do not plan to update social media other than to inform you of changes to our operating status." The closure affects all the Smithsonian's 21 museums, its research centers, and the National Zoo. As worried social media users expressed concern about the well-being of the animals at the zoo, the Smithsonian assured its supporters that the animals would still be cared for during the zoo's closure. All the animals at the zoo and at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute in Front Royal, Virginia, will continue to be fed and cared for. The Smithsonian said a shutdown will not affect our commitment to the safety of our staff and standard excellence in animal care. The zoo's beloved animal camps, however, are considered non-essential and will be turned off for the remainder of the shutdown. The Smithsonian receives about 62% of its funding from the federal government, which helps support free admission to all of its DC museums and the National Zoo. Its facilities have been able to keep their doors open for the first 11 days of the shutdown by relying on prior year funds. But those coffers have since run dry. The Smithsonian is just one of the most recent entities to find itself ensnared in the ongoing dispute on government funding. Some national parks around the country have also been forced to close as staff have been deemed non-essential and sent home until Congress can reach an agreement on government funding. On Friday, thousands of federal employees across agencies, including the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Education, began receiving reduction in forces notices, informing them that they would be laid off. Hamas releases Israeli hostages as world leaders sign peace deal in Egypt. President Donald Trump and Egypt's President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi hold signed documents during a summit to support ending the more than 2-year Israel-Hamas war in Gaza after a breakthrough ceasefire deal Monday, October 13th, 2025, in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Tel Aviv. President Trump declared the Gaza war over and received a standing ovation in Israel Parliament, then in Egypt, at a signing ceremony on Monday for his leading role in bringing about a ceasefire in the war-ravaged territory. In a crucial part of the agreement, Hamas released the last 20 living Israeli hostages who had been kept captive for just over 2 years. In turn, Israel freed nearly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners and detainees. Most of the Palestinians were taken from Israeli prisons, placed on buses, and driven to either Gaza or the West Bank. They were greeted by cheering crowds, along with hugs from friends and family. Israel was also sending some abroad, effectively placing them in exile. The released Palestinians, including some who had been convicted of killings and imprisoned for decades, though most had been detained without charge during the past 2 years of fighting. Trump calls it a new era. This is the historic dawn of the new Middle East, Trump told the members of Israel's parliament, the Knesset. Generations from now, this will be remembered as the moment that everything began to change, and change very much for the better, Trump said in a speech frequently punctuated with applause. Like the USA right now, it will be the golden age of Israel and the golden age of the Middle East. Israeli lawmakers chanted Trump's name, and he received a prolonged standing ovation at the end of his lengthy speech filled with grandiose language. Since taking effect Friday, the ceasefire has been holding after the deadliest fighting ever between Israelis and Palestinians. And if Israel and Hamas can complete the exchange of prisoners and hostages as outlined in the agreement, that should provide additional momentum for an agreement that still faces many obstacles. Trump is a staunch backer of Israel, though he put considerable pressure on Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, to accept the ceasefire proposal. Trump also leaned on Arab countries like Egypt and Qatar to get Hamas to agree to the truce. Speaking before Trump, Net called the U.S. president the greatest friend that the State of Israel has ever had in the White House. The handover of hostages. In the hours before Trump spoke, Hamas handed over the 20 Israeli hostages in 2 separate groups to the International Committee of the Red Cross inside Gaza. The Red Cross then delivered the hostages to the Israeli military, which whisked them out of the territory. To a military base in southern Israel. From there, they were flown by helicopter to hospitals in the Tel Aviv area. All the hostages were men, and all were in their 20s and 30s, except for one, who was in his 40s. Israeli television showed Einav Zanger speaking to her son Matan Zanger, 25, in a video call shortly after his release. "There is no war. It's over. You're coming home," she told him. Pictures released by the Israel Defense Forces showed smiling hostages being reunited with their families. A video showed the moment hostage Etan Moore, 25, was reunited with his family, and his father hugged him and wept loudly. The hostage handover ignited celebrations throughout Israel. Tens of thousands gathered in Hostages Square, the plaza, in Tel Aviv that has been the site of vigils throughout the war. The crowd roared in jubilation and waved blue and white Israeli flags. Hamas is also required to hand over 28 bodies of dead hostages, though the Palestinian group says it has not been able to locate them all. The Israeli military said 4 coffins containing deceased hostages had been escorted out of Gaza for identification at a forensic medicine center. Before leaving the Palestinian territory, they were draped with Israeli flags, while Israeli soldiers saluted. After the brief visit to Israel, Trump flew to Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, where the truce was negotiated last week, to take part in a formal signing ceremony. Leaders from Israel and Hamas were not invited initially. Egypt extended a last-minute invitation to Netz on Monday, but he declined, citing a Jewish holiday. Mahmoud Abbas, the president of Palestinian Authority, joined leaders from more than 20 nations as they gathered around Egypt's president, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who spoke first. El-Sisi called the moment the birth of glimmer of hope, that this agreement will close a painful chapter in human history and open the door to a new era of peace and stability in the Middle East, adding that it could offer a better tomorrow for the peoples of the region, exhausted by conflict. A beaming President Trump took the podium after a standing ovation, flanked by the leaders of Spain, Italy, and the United Kingdom, Canada, and the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. This is a day that people across the region and around the world have been working, striving, hoping, and praying for, Trump told the assembled dignitaries. With the historic agreement we have just signed, those prayers of millions have finally been answered. Trump went on to assert that peace in the region had now been achieved after years of talking about it, and that as civilians in Gaza were returning to their homes, humanitarian aid was now pouring in, including hundreds of truckloads of food, medical equipment, and other supplies, much of it paid for by people in this room. Essentials in Gaza have been critically short supply throughout the war, and the significant increase in aid began to enter southern Gaza from Egypt on Sunday. The territory is in urgent need of food, water, medicine, fuel, and tents. U.S. President Donald Trump is welcomed by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and officials at Ben Gurion International Airport on October 13, 2025, in Tel Aviv, Israel. Test for the ceasefire. While the ceasefire is off to a good start, many large questions have not been resolved. Israeli troops pulled back on Friday, but still hold roughly half of Gaza. They are eventually supposed to carry out additional pullbacks, but there's no timeline for their full withdrawal. The ceasefire also calls for Hamas to give up its weapons and play no role in the future of governance of Gaza. Hamas has not publicly agreed to this, and Hamas civilian police have already re-emerged on the streets of the territory. The ceasefire calls for a group of Palestinian technocrats to run Gaza on an interim basis, but they have not been named, and it is not clear what kind of authority that they would have, if any.